folks, and thanks for joining us here at Some Future for episode 15 of our podcast. We are your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hey.
Guys, today we've got some pretty interesting topics. It appears that my pessimism is finally wearing off on Chris. Still, we're trying to look at multiple perspectives in an attempt to give you, our audience, a chance to make your own conclusions about the validity of the arguments that we will be putting forward. On Present Futures, we will be discussing the technologies and ways to reverse climate change. We will also be discussing animal and human extinction. On PaleoFutures, we will be talking about Philip K. Dick. And on FizBiz, we will be discussing the future of real estate in our cities. And as always, we will have a prominent futurist as our guest. We hope that you enjoy our show, and please visit our website and blog where we post our supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle @SomeFuture, or visit us on our Facebook page. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com or by engaging with us on social media. Now let's see what the future has in store for us in Some Future.
That's Some Future. Okay, cool. So for my present future today, I know, like you were saying, Jack, I'm normally the positive energy on the show, or at least leaning towards positive. But I pulled up this article. I don't know if you saw it too. It was kind of scary. Scientists warn of countdown to the extinction of the human race is accelerating. Geez, we better get this podcast out as quickly as possible, you know? So essentially, this study is really about human sperm, right? So a lot of scientists, they've been doing this sort of groundbreaking research, trying to assess the sperm counts of men all across the world. And so they looked at men in North America, Europe, and Australia, and they have found that sperm count has halved in less than 40 years, right? And it's sort of a mystery, right? And so we're talking, it's even different. So sperm concentrations, they've declined by 52.4% during this study period, and total sperm count has declined by 59.3%. So scientists are disturbed about this, and not only this, but they're thinking about other things, such as the impact of mutations on the human population. And if these mutation rates continue, there could be problems with the actual procreation. I know we actually did a paleo future on children of men, where this idea of us not being able to reproduce is kind of ideated on. We think about what can happen. So this has kind of profound implications, because the human race is a very important part of the story of the Earth, and so this is kind of a crazy story. I don't know, what did you think when you heard this all these statistics?
I can tell you the first sentence that came in my mind was, "Dude, this is scary." Because I was thinking to myself, I was like, well, do we wipe ourselves out by prescribing all of these antibiotics and viruses and other types of diseases that are getting progressively worse and worse? Is there another Ebola that's going to happen, or we're going to wipe ourselves out in some other way by making ourselves sterile? This asks the question, what will the role of technology be in reproduction? We've talked about, like you mentioned, children of men, where people are unable to have children. Talked about artificial wombs, where children may be grown as opposed to growing inside a woman. There's still many questions as to the role of technology in our reproductive futures. So, you tell me, man. This is all scary.
No,
So I called you a pessimist today.
I don't know if you're like me. I'm a little apprehensive. I have not had children yet. So and I'm getting married, and so obviously that's a potential, right? And so whenever I have my laptop near me or my cell phone, I'm very cognizant now. I was before, but I'm very cognizant. Now, of course, after this, I think what makes this an interesting story is that we're not just talking about the extinction of mankind through all these different ways, right? It could be technology, through as you were alluding to, the antibiotics, us poisoning the planet actually could be leading to this too. But we're actually in the we're in the sixth known extinction currently as well, right? So a Elizabeth Colbert, she won the Pulitzer Prize for this book, The Sixth Extinction, where she's giving voice to the sixth extinction event currently. There's a lot of these mammals and wildlife around that's being decimated, mostly possibly due to climate change. But there's a big issue with the Earth not being able to sustain life, and so I think this idea of humanity and or the Earth not necessarily caring about itself is highly worrisome. I think when we think about extinctions, I think we think of maybe the charismatic megafauna. We think, oh, we don't want the rhino to go away, or we don't want the elephant to go away. But when we think about extinction, it could be things like plankton or maybe certain types of bacteria, as you were alluding to too. So, the certain good antibiotics, or excuse me, certain good bacteria versus bad bacteria, and how that could affect human life. And fish, ecology, the type of animals that we eat and we ingest, and that are part of the ecosystems. All of this is actually super important. So to me, yes, we can have a meltdown about what's happening with sperm, and we're going to have to. I mean, I'm assuming there's going to be a lot of men scientists as well as women scientists are going to. What the heck is going on with men's sperm, right? But the bigger question is that how is humanity going to ensure that either through our actions, through technology, or through the human experience, us being in cities, us using natural resources of the planet, and the black swan effect of possible, how we shape the world, how this has a profound impact on Earth. We need to desperately understand all of these mechanisms, right? It's not just the fall of a city state or a nation or a group of nations, right? In sort of an economic destruction or a cultural destruction, which I think you hear a lot. But we're talking about life on Earth is super important. So we need to, I think, get way better at understanding this and understanding how we impact not only ourselves, but how we impact the world on a truly calculable state.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that much that we have this going on, because if you look at what happened in Japan with the nuclear disaster with the nuclear plant there, they said that even though they were able to capture most of what happened, they said that it has now, all the pollution, the nuclear pollution, has spread throughout the entire Pacific Ocean. Like they showed, I saw a map just showing like where all of the pollution has gone. And I mean, can you imagine that people are swimming in that ocean, eating fish from that ocean? That's not the only nuclear disaster we've had. There's been other nuclear disasters and nuclear bombs, and all of that's getting thrown up into the atmosphere. And it doesn't surprise me that these things are happening, and that not only are we being affected, but it's killing off entire animal species that maybe aren't as easy to adapt as we are. So I mean, it's I see it happening, man, and we have to find a way to reverse it. That's why I was talking about technology, because I feel like even though technology can be a very harmful thing to the world, as in creating the nuclear or atom bomb, it also, I think, can help us solve these issues that we ourselves are creating.
You're totally right. And one thing that I found, so I went and I found this website talking about the sixth extinction and all the different animals that went extinct and insects and whatnot. And it's a very thorough website. I'll put it in the show notes. But what I found is the tools that it was talking about in terms of the conservation of for these animals, the tools that we can do. If we kind of just change some of the wording, it actually could be for the conservation of ourselves as well, not just the biodiversity, but also humanity, right? So effective management of and restoration of our habitats and ecosystems. That's very important for humanity in terms of the habitats that we have inside of cities, and keeping things like national parks open so we can have big, huge swaths of forests that do a good job of filtering, acting as the lungs of the planet. The enforcement of key agreements such as the Convention of Biological Diversity, Convention of Migratory Species, Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species. Key agreements across different nations is really important for us understanding how antibiotics are used, understanding technologies, climate change, obviously, when it comes to the Paris Climate Accord. So, incentives and finance for conservation. You see that we can maybe have an incentive for keeping humanity going. Maybe prizes. I know the Singularity has that X Prize. We're trying to figure out that tricorder. So, and of course, equitable sharing of costs. This is happening when it comes to a lot of different fish ecology that's happening everywhere. So, I think sometimes our environmental brothers and sisters, they have a lot of really great ideas, right? And I think when you have a scientific study like this come out, where we're talking about the degradation of the human reproduction possibility, this kind of gets people scratching their heads like, wow, is this a possibility? Could we have a virus that is going to wipe out humanity, like what we talked about, what happened with AIDS or Ebola, right? Something that scares folks, right? We can actually create tools together as humanity in order to effectively look at all these issues that are coming up, right? And I think if it takes news reports to kind of scare us into this every now and again, I think these are a good thing. So what I'm very much looking into is are we, me and you, going to see maybe on our podcast more stories about humans themselves figuring out, okay, it's not just the earth, it's also what we're doing to ourselves, whether it's through war, whether it's through technology, whether it's through anything that's affecting us negatively and might maybe affecting our reproductive systems, but also how we live together. So, I think it's a bigger question. It's bigger than just us ensuring that we have double the sperm count than we have now. It's actually how are we going to take care of ourselves, take care of the earth, so we can perpetuate ourselves as the human species.
All right, hey Chris. So I kind of wanted to piggyback off of your idea here with my present futures. And I think that this is kind of maybe we're doing the reversal of roles, man. I'm the optimist this time. So, so for my present futures today, I want to discuss climate change. Recently, there's been a lot of interesting technologies in the news where people are trying to reverse the harmful effects of climate change. First, we need to look specifically at what type of technologies are being created. Secondly, I wanted to look at the technology and innovation and see if that can actually fix the problems that we're experiencing with global climate change. So, starting with our first area, I wanted to examine technologies that exist or are being created to combat the harmful effects of climate change. I recently posted on Twitter about this new technology that's being used in China. Of course, China. So it was invented by a Dutch inventor, and it's called the smog-free tower, which is 23 feet high, takes harmful pollutants out of the air, just about 1.06 million cubic feet of air per hour, and uses 1,400 watts of electricity, so about as much as a large crock pot, so not very much, to do this. It leaves the air 75% cleaner, and it compresses the carbon that it takes out of the air and then makes diamonds out of it that are then sold and used to fund the construction of even more of these towers.
No, don't tell my fiance.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love this technology because, the financial side of me is the guy's going like, yeah, man, they're finding a way to perpetuate this technology. I mean, this is a good deal for China, as, currently air pollution is listed as responsible for roughly 17% of all Chinese deaths. So that's not a small number. And I think what makes it great is that it's not necessarily a new technology. I mean, carbon capture has been around for years. What makes it and other technologies so great is that they're becoming cheaper. In the case of the smog-free tower, it's finding ways to continue this process by turning a profit for the operator of the tower. Still, according to UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, nearly 500 billion tons of CO2 needs to be taken out of the atmosphere this century in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So that's just a small drop in the bucket. The panel has actually, if you look at what they've actually suggested a way to do this. They suggest building new plants that resemble coal plants, but that burn fast-growing plant material and then capture the carbon that is released. However, if you look at it, this would actually be very difficult to implement because these plants would then compete with the growing of food for the world's growing populations. So, do you grow plants for electricity or do you grow them to eat? And most people would say to eat. So my question for you, Chris, is, what do you know about biofuels? Do you think they're a good way to reduce our carbon emissions?
I think any type of additional fuel source is helpful, right? We had Gary Golden on here. Gary Golden talked to us about the fact that, hey, by the way, the hydrocarbon industry is probably not going away anytime soon, right? And that may be a good thing because, we just seen in recent news reports that these companies are actually also investing in renewable resources as well. Obviously, there's electric cars, carbon capture. There's a lot to me. Throw everything at this problem, right? However we can keep our cities going, keep humanity growing as much as possible. We'll talk about that. That's another comment to talk about, right? But in terms of the engine that is our ingenuity, to steal one of my favorite radio shows from Houston when I lived there, we have to have multiple different types of fuel, and biofuel is a way. I think this carbon capture story it's fascinating, and it's definitely something that's particularly helpful. I think even, when we're talking about planting trees, right, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, we're still doing that as a way to, as I was in a previous talk that we were having, trees are the lungs of the earth. So the more trees we have, the better chance we have of sort of filtering all the bad stuff out as well. So yes, of course, I like biofuels. I like electronics. I like as clean natural gas as we can pull out. I'm not opposed to this stuff because I do understand that, if we want to have the United States of America, or we want to have Europe or any place on earth, hey, guess what? Sometimes we're going to have to use gasoline. Sometimes we're going to have to use natural gas. Sometimes we're going to think nuclear is a better option. Maybe we figure out eventually fusion energy. So we have to be smart about how we use our energy, and we have to do it in a methodical and a thoughtful way.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that we need to find a way to do this because right now, as it is, we would need about 100 million carbon capture devices like these towers to combat the current amount of CO2 that's being released into the atmosphere every year. So that's just not a very viable solution. And even these plant fuels and stuff like that, they're still polluters. You have to find a way to either eliminate pollution completely, or is it fair to ask the developing economies in Africa to not use fossil fuels because we all know it's bad, but we used them before? Like that's something. If it's cheap, why would we stop them from doing that? We have to think about what are the solutions.
Yeah.
Is there a real way to combat pollution and the rising pollution rates?
Yeah, of course. And it's, to me, it's about ideating and doing things that are hard, right? And figuring out what's some low hanging fruit and also some big ideas that we can figure out to do this. Some things are like what I was alluding to before, right? The growing human population. We have to make sure that we don't grow too quickly, right? So actually, I'm not talking about eugenics or anything. We can't have that. But we're just talking about family planning in sub-Saharan Africa. Effective birth control measures for everyone. We're not saying specific people. That's not the type of podcast that we have. But what we're saying is we want to ensure that countries realize, that it's important to not have too many people, because for countries in the world, that's more resources that humanity is going to have to come out. one of these, and then we have to come up with like hard choices that sometimes are, I like to call it, like ugly economics or ugly urban planning, right? So, this is a perfect example of this ugly urban planning, right? Nobody wants to change their city. No one wants to redesign New York City. So it's better made, right? Because it's iconic, right? There's certain skylines. You look at Paris, or you look at New York, or you look at certain cities. Like, we can't redo this. We can't just redo it. It's of its own. It's gonna lose its cachet. But the new cities, and like you were talking about in Africa, these new burgeoning cities, we can actually plan them to be very resource effective, creating circular cities, making sure that there's no lost energy. We can create architecture that has cool roofs, or we can ensure that we're able to cool off not only inside of the buildings, but also create a more viable outside, a viable beautiful place that is ecologically and environmentally conscious, right? And we can think about that and ideate that and do little things that helps. But I think sometimes it's hard for people to make these changes, and especially in a country like America, which is it's very difficult to change. I think our European brothers and sisters, they're a little bit more capable of making these changes. There's one of my favorite stories about this ugly environmentalism is the sun chips. Like, the sun chips had this really great biodegradable bag, and it was beautiful. Like, and it was shiny and everything like that, and you could throw it away and it'd be biodegradable, and it's great for the environment. Sun chips is a kind of earthy type of chip. Holler at Sun Chips. I like the original. But they got rid of the bag. Why? Because the bag was too loud. It was too loud. So people they stopped selling it because the market said something. And I think we have to think about, okay, what's important for us, right? Is it living on Earth, right? It can't just be about economics. It can't just be about how pretty things are. It can't just be about you like to jam out. Sometimes having a bicycle day is really important, right? This happened in Copenhagen, right? It's a bicycle city, right? I'm not saying that Houston, Texas needs to turn into a bicycle city overnight, but some cities are doing this where they're making it to where bicycles and this types of the pedal movement, making it more walkable. This is better for the city because it's environmentally and ecologically conscious. So we have to make sacrifices. The only way we can better the earth is to actually sometimes, do the ugly environmentalism stuff that's going to help us continue to live.
Yeah, I mean, you touched exactly on what my next point was changing society. So, I mean, obviously, this is going to take a combination of changing human behaviors and technology in order to work. One thing that I was going to touch on, and that you talked about, was that we need to educate women and girls in all across the world. Educated women actually, on average, have about 2 children. So that would drastically reduce the world's population, which is a primary cause of pollution. Think more people, that obviously equals more polluters, more pollution. And more governments are also, and it's another societal change, they're also passing rules that are putting taxes on carbon and are trying to remove the use of fossil fuels completely by certain dates. I mean, if you look in the United States, you'll see all these smart city initiatives, like in Orlando, Atlanta, and all of San Francisco. They're saying, we're going to be completely on renewable energies by this date, 2040, 2025, 2035. Is it too little, too late? I don't know. That's the question that we have to ask ourselves, and we have to. That's why when we look at this, and I know we've touched on environmental issues a lot in our show, we have to realize that it's going to be a combination of these smart towers that are going to make the changes, and a combination of society changing its norms, of accepting the crinkly bag and and making that determination that, hey, we have to save ourselves and, save our sperm counts, or save the 1,508 vertebrates that are going to go extinct by the end of the century. Have to do these things, in order to keep our world, our precious world, full of life and able to continue for the next 100 years and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I know. I heard something. I think that's really appropriate to this, and we're not a political show, but it was about the hysteria that's happening inside the United States in terms of the Donald Trump administration. And what I heard was, and I thought it was actually pretty insightful. It said that the media needs to stop getting mad at what Trump is saying and talk about what negative and or positive consequences come from policy decisions, right? So we can't just, as Americans, just, oh, no way, you want me to drive this type of car? You want me to do this? No, I mean, let's eliminate the hysteria of the action and let's discuss the reaction, right? Okay, so that's something that, absolutely, right? So, like you said, education is vital to this, understanding it. And, we're getting to a place where we're developing a lot of different data sources. It's wonderful. We're going to have, Internet of Things, lots of sensors on things, smart dust, which is something maybe we need to do a podcast on to discuss. So there's going to be a lot of data resources, and this is going to be really helpful for us to not only educate ourselves, educate other members of society, tell people exactly what's happening with the world. And I think this sort of information is going to be vital because we're going to be able to kind of move past the hysteria, move past the shock of something, and actually make calculated decisions that are going to help ourselves and help our planet. Okay, cool. So on PaleoFutures today, I've got one of the greatest science fiction authors of all time, and one of like really the coolest movies. I think I'm a big fan of his, post novel and novella movies. So we're talking Philip Kindred Dick. I actually didn't know his middle name, but now I do. So Philip K. Dick. So he was a American author. He's notable for his science fiction work, explored philosophical, social, political themes in his novels. And they're all dominated by monopolistic corporations, authoritarian governments, alternate universes, altered states of consciousness. Really interested in metaphysics and theology. And, a lot of his themes were, about really complicated big ideas, epistemology, the nature of who we are in reality, knowing yourself, android and human dynamics, so this guy was talking about robots and humans, just like, Arthur C. Clarke. So some famous, so he had 44 published novels. Okay. One of his first ones, The Man in the High Castle, which is now on Amazon. It won the Hugo Award for Best Novel in 1962. He's written things like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sleep and Ubik. And then he has other novels such as Scanner Darkly and Valis. Pretty great guy. But not only that, but his works have actually been produced into a lot of great movies. Some of the, really the greatest science fiction movies of all time. This includes Blade Runner, Total Recall, Minority Report, Scanner Darkly, Paycheck, Next, Adjustment Bureau. In some ways, this guy is, if anything, one of the most important, science fiction movie minds, but also just a science fiction writer in itself. I mean, Philip K. Dick. What do you think, Jack?
So I have a mixed feelings about Philip K. Dick because he had a very tragic life as well, and so like that's where like a lot of his themes come from. And he explored things like epistemology and the nature of reality, knowing thyself, the android and the human, entropy and like pot healing, warfare, power politics, the evolved human, technology, media, drugs, madness. All of these things were things that he covered and wrote about in his novels. And if you look at like it toward his later life, like he never made any money off his like novels. He really died kind of poor. Like a lot, I guess a lot of the great literary minds like Poe. He so he had like all of these great ideas, and He was inspired by like the Wells of society, like H.G. Wells, and he was a so like one of his thoughts, and this is kind of where this is where I think of like some people who write science fiction. It's kind of how they have to be. He originally described himself as a cosmic pantheist. He believed in the universe only as an extension of God. He came to the conclusion that the world is not really real. So it's a lot of really cool, like crazy ideas behind the man, and I can go into it even more and more, but I don't want to touch on anything and what you want to say. So.
No. I mean, you're absolutely right, and I think there's a little bit of torture artist. I mean, not even a little bit. I mean, even in himself, one of these quotes I found is, "When I believe I'm crazy, when I don't believe, I suffer from psychotic depression." Right. So yes, inside of him was somebody who really just was creating worlds because he himself could not understand what was happening inside of himself, right? These, paranoid illusions and these alternate realities and alternate worlds, and you not knowing who you are in these realities. This was really big to him. He was fascinated with something called the simulacra. So these are highly complicated ways of interacting with the broader world, right? And the paradoxes between the organic life that we create and the inorganic life that we're creating when it comes to like things like humans. And matter of fact, that's what makes him a super awesome futurist, because he's actually doing the stuff that you and I are talking about all the time, right? In terms of like, what is it going to be when we enter the singularity and we are not going to be us anymore, right? And there's something fascinating because he is not doing it purely from a ones and zeros, like, okay, we're going to have robots in our skin and these things are going to fix us, and I'm going to have you're going to connect me like Neo, and I'm going to be able to download Kung Fu, and you and I are going to be able to talk like the Borg, right? Like, that's really cool. It's fascinating. Futurists love to talk about it. He's actually talking about the psychological impact of that. What does it mean when I am not me? And not only that, but what does it mean when I'm not me and I'm like dealing with people that aren't like me or are like me? And like, how does that deal with my psychology? How does that make me understand? And that's what I think is really important about The Man in the High Castle, right? So it's considered his best novel. And The Man in the High Castle, really, it's not a futures kind of a novel. It's actually really just an alternate universe novel. And he said that this novel, actually, it really impacted him. He actually had to, he looked at the I Ching, the Chinese philosophical tome, talking about, how to live on Earth, pretty much. And he wanted to understand the proper course and wanted to understand, what the proper dynamics of humanity could be. Because when he started to research, the Nazis and sort of how to position them for this novel, he was like, man, some of this stuff is really dark and awful, and I don't know if I can get it outside of my heart. And so he would sort of use that as a way to kind of pull himself back, from this plot device in The Man of the High Castle. So I think, he definitely was wrestling his demons, but in some ways the world got to understand what it's this psychological view extremely well.
But I have one
go ahead.
On The Man in the High Castle, just real quick, is
sure.
that I find that people who write science fiction not only write about the future, which is like what we normally think of in science fiction, they often write about the past, and like they ask the question of what if. And I think that they ask that for the future, but they also ask that for the past, and that's what this novel, I think, does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And the idea is what if this happens? What happens to us as people? What happens to society? How what's the back and forth, right? And what are the ramifications, right? And this happens a lot in futures. We are constantly looking at present futures, right? And we're constantly looking at new news articles, and we're saying, wow, this is great, or wow, this is terrible, or wow, whatever. But we actually don't extrapolate. We don't create a world and say, okay, we're going to choose this, and then we're going to paint a world of what this would be like. I think the best science fiction, and in some ways the best futurist type of works, and that's what we try to draw out here in PaleoFutures, is the science fiction or the futurist works that allow us to step inside the black swan events, right? The Children of Men. We'll go back to his work, right? Children of Men is, of course, without the inability for reproduction and a post-apocalyptic society. His work, Scanner Darkly, and the idea of a man not knowing who he is, right, and not him trying to figure out where he is in society as he's trying to chase down these drug users, right? When you
know the interesting story about that?
Sure, go for it. Yeah,
that's based off of an actual experience he had. So when because he was really into this drug, these drugs, he towards the middle to later end of his life, he became a drug addict.
Yeah, he's doing LSD, and he wrote most of his articles on methamphetamines.
Yeah, well, he actually in about middle of his life, he got divorced and he got into this depression, and he invited all of these drug users to actually live in his home, and they actually stole from him. And so that's kind of where that whole idea came from Scanner Darkly, is that these people that he was chasing down, and that's where he got the idea for the novel.
Right. Yeah. And well, so right. So he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know what's going on. You look at the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sleep, which is the basis for Blade Runner, and it's the interactions with humans and androids, and who is real and who is real and who is not. Who is how can you tell, and how do you work your way through that, right? Total Recall, the idea of being able to download your brain or transport to another world, and what is this real, is this not? Minority Report, which is the idea of precognition, and chasing down pre-crime. I mean, obviously Philip K. Dick, he is he's a titan, I guess, in terms of the science fiction land. And if anything, I think I equate him to something like oh man, I lost his name.
Asimov?
No, not Asimov. Who's that? Who's the horror writer in around the turn of the century? Cthulhu was his guy. I don't even know why I just
H.G. Wells?
No, Cthulhu mythos. That was H.P. Lovecraft. So H.P. H.P. Lovecraft. I'm sorry, my apologies. Sorry, folks. I should have known that. Is my apologies. To me,
I should know too.
Right, so I think they're different. H.P. Lovecraft, from what I've read in his biographies, was hermitish and sickly, and wrote about these fantastic things because he was dreaming of fantastic things in his head. Almost like a Kafka type of character. But both of these guys to me are similar because there's a darkness to the human, to the human idea, right? There's darkness inside of us. There's and they're using either horror or science fiction to give voice to the darkness that we have, and also the way to deal with that darkness, right? Every now and again, you have to shine a light on the dark parts of what it takes to be a human being, to understand how to get through those dark parts. So I'm a big fan of Philip K. Dick. I highly recommend folks go pick up some of these novels. I read Scanner Darkly before. I have also read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sleep? Sheep, pardon me. They're very quick. They're fun novels. I think I need to get on that Amazon show, the Man in the High Castle. Yeah, I heard it's really good. Go out there, folks. Philip K. Dick is probably going to be fascinating us for a long time. He's a big, huge movie person, and I don't know. I thank Philip K. Dick for being a crazy weirdo. My movie watching and book book reading has been extremely helpful ever since he came on the scene. I miss him.
All right, folks, it's time for FizBiz.
FizBiz!
Yeah! So, on this segment of FizBiz, we're going to get into real estate speculating, right?
Okay.
No, seriously, we're going to talk about what you might want to do in the future when considering investing in real estate. And here we go again. Y'all know I have to always state this, that anything you hear on this show is our own opinions, and you alone are responsible for your finances. So if you want to make your own decision, that'd be great, because we're not responsible for any financial losses you experience by making your own decisions.
And blame Jack, too. Just blame Jack, and you'll be better off. I'm just kidding. Folks.
So, Chris, this may be way out of left field on this one, but I wanted to talk to you about trends that I see that are going to happen in the real estate market. So if you've studied the history of cities, you've noticed an interesting pattern since the growth of what we consider the modern city. And I'm putting air quotes around the modern city. There's been a flow of people first moving to cities during the Industrial Revolution and then moving outside the cities as the automobile allowed people to move further and further outside of their workplaces. More recently, in the past, let's say 50 or 60 years, just before and then after World War II in the United States, people have moved into the cities searching for work and then into the suburbs as we became more service-oriented. And then back into the cities, which is what's happening now with things like gentrification in New York City. And that's due to a number of reasons. What I can tell you is that I believe the next wave is actually going to go back to the suburbs and maybe even further. So according to the National Resources Inventory, or NRI, about 8,900 square kilometers, or 2.2 million acres of land in the United States, was developed between 1992 and 2002. Presently, the NRI classifies approximately 100,000 more square kilometers, or 40,000 square miles, which is an area approximately the size of Kentucky, is developing as urban spaces. With transportation communication technologies evolving, I believe that the next stage of housing will be large, affordable houses outside the city, which will be an easy ride to the city, but with actual space, with what I consider new methods of transportation. I believe that large plantation-style houses are in our future as we develop new ways to travel, which don't require sitting in traffic for these huge amounts of time. So it's basically what urban population scientists have been predicting. Cities are going to sprawl and have been doing this, so that's nothing new. But I imagine that the level of acceleration is going to happen when you can get from point A to point B. It's going to grow so much faster than what we could think of. So with the cost of living inside cities rising, I think this is the next solution or the next trend. So if you take a city like Sydney, Australia, as an example, in Sydney, the ratio of the price of a house relative to income is 9-1. In many Asian cities and other mega cities, these ratios are only continuing to rise. Even my own native Atlanta, it's actually rising. The cost of owning a home is rising. It's growing by many percentage points, and I just see this is going to be a continuing trend. So think of it, Chris. Like, cities are growing at an unprecedented rate, but with the world facing a larger crisis, such as the risk for more serious infectious diseases, which we've talked about in this episode, the possibilities of wars with nuclear targets remaining the large cities, and with technologies like the Hyperloop and flying cars becoming more and more of a reality, why do people need to actually live in the city to get a city life? Some people may choose to live in a city, but why? Why do that when you can get the same amenities by sitting in an autonomous vehicle for the same amount of time and still maybe working from your autonomous vehicle? So that's the crux of my argument. New technologies are going to enable cities to sprawl unlike ever before. Right now, I believe cities are kind of pushing their limits with sprawl. But cities like LA and Atlanta facing huge commute times, people aren't willing to live more than 2 hours outside the city. But I believe technology is going to change that for us. So, Chris, what do you think about this? Do you agree that this is going to be do you agree with my assessment that you think that that's the next trend?
Well, the fact that you're going up against what all futurists are saying is very interesting, which I really like. That's very cool. Uh, I mean, yes and no. I mean, does that make any sense? I mean, the one thing about cities that I really enjoy, I live near New York City. I live an hour away from New York City, and I talk to my fiance about this all the time that it is a fantastic place to be because of the interconnection, right? I get to hear lots of different languages, lots of different ideas, great bookstores, excellent food, and it's a chance to understand and learn about all different types of stuff because you've got a bunch of people, right? So there's a lot of mixing and mashing and connectedness and other things that you're not going to get by living in suburbia or living in the country. Now, totally understand, and I totally get it, right? How there is a major problem with urban sprawl, right? If you go to LA, the massive traffic, pollution, too much population is bad for some folks. They I'm not sure of this, and maybe we can kind of look this up, but my guess is there's a vibration too of living inside of a city. So when you're stacked on top of each other, a lot of people don't like that, right? There's a negative connotation to being pushed against each other, and this goes if you're inside Tokyo and you're inside of a tiny little apartment, or it goes also if you're smashed in apartment buildings, like in Los Angeles County, and you're stuck in traffic for 3 to 4 hours a day. So I could totally see how I work from home, you work from home. The allure of being able to work from anywhere is highly helpful. And there's a lot of technologies that are going to allow us to collaborate even better. I mean, we've had John Smart on the podcast, on our first podcast. He was talking about the idea of having personal bots, so personal avatars, where we can download our consciousness into something that could allow me to actually do this podcast with you in my avatar mode. And while I am out there presenting on behalf of my company, but I'm doing that from my home, and they're transporting my image in front of a presentation screen for a lot of people. So this is a total possibility, but I see that also in the burgeoning world, in the new world, right? The fastest growing cities are actually those cities that are not like New York City or not like LA, even though they are actually still growing at great rates. We're talking about Karachi, we're talking about cities in Bangladesh, we're talking about cities in sub-Saharan Africa, Lagos. Right, right. And we're talking right in percentage. And so these cities, that's where the commerce is, right? That's where all the things are happening. That's where you can go to make it, right? And we're lucky we live in the United States because you can just come to the United States to quote unquote make it, right? You can move, an immigrant family can move to Dearborn, Michigan. They can move to New York City. They can move to Little Rock, Arkansas, and build a restaurant, create a business, do what have you. And that's what's great about America. You have this huge swath of land that allows us to do a bunch of stuff, right? But in other countries, the main city, the capital city, or these large burgeoning cities are where you go to succeed and grab a big piece of life, right? And so I see both happening. Maybe, in the Western sense, perhaps we're going to have the technology to where we're going to be able to not have to do the commuting. But for the burgeoning middle classes that are happening around the world, my guess is that no, they're going to move to the Karachis so they can go out and have a good life.
Yeah. So I wanted to end this with saying, well, why is this on FizBiz? Like, why am I talking about this on FizBiz? It's because I believe that if you're a smart real estate investor, you would recognize that this may be a trend and make the appropriate investments. Like, there's large swaths of former farmland that are out there for sale as farming families increasingly turn towards the cities or sell their land to large conglomerates who don't use it. Or frankly, I think that if you're a wise real estate investor, you will see this trend and make good early investments to take full advantage of what I believe is the future of real estate. That's I like you said, this is the trends that I see happening. I see that eventually the world population is going to go down. What's going to happen is that people are going to have increased methods of transportation, ways to be seen and collaborate without having to be there. More people are going to work from home or not work at all with the rise in robotic technologies and artificial intelligence. So this is a trend that I see that could happen, and maybe I'm wrong. That's why I'm throwing it out there, and I'm not telling you to do it. I'm just saying maybe look at it and see if I'm right.
Well, here's a really good, I think, idea when it comes to this idea, right? You could be wrong in terms of the impact of this trend. What I don't think you're wrong at is that there's all sorts of people that are going to do all sorts of stuff with this technology. So if anything, let's also think about the technology. What are people going to need to do to have a really appropriate office inside the home? That's something that we're kind of in the middle with, right? There's not a lot of like technologies that allow us to be interconnected, right? Like right now, all we need is a computer, a laptop, a phone. But there's other sort of technologies that might make it even easier for us to work from home, present from home. As I was saying, personal avatars. If there's a company that comes up with that might be something to invest in. Also, the ideas of the companies that are building these sorts of areas, the type of homes that are being developed, and are they particularly novel and impressive for these would-be new neo suburbanites that are moving to the country and whatnot. And I think too, the leisure type of activities that are going to happen, right? So a lot of the community and the restaurants and all that sort of stuff, those happen in cities just because economics, right? You're gonna go ahead and invest in cities. Well, there could be new sort of country cities, country communities that may be popping up, and you may want to pay attention to the type of commerce that is helpful to them, right? Right now, there's this. I keep seeing all these memes about the millennials are killing this industry. They're killing this restaurant. They're killing Applebee's. They're killing, they're killing Bennigan's. The millennials don't want to buy cars. It's just millennial apocalypse because millennials aren't doing certain things. Well, hey, millennials are buying certain things. Millennials are doing, and by the way, Generation Z is coming right behind them and is going to be doing other purchases as well. So what this means is that if you're a savvy investor, you're going to understand where people live, what people buy, and what are the trends in terms of how we function as society. So living conditions is super important. Where people are moving to is super important because it makes you think about, okay, what are the investments I should make? In terms of the taste and the culture, the food that they're eating, how they're living their lives, what is important, to them in terms of when they're in an autonomous car or when they are presenting. So I think you're right to key on this. We don't think about we think about real estate as houses, but I don't think we think real estate when it comes to like it's your home, it's your community. So think about the community. What is helping shape that community? What is what are people investing in terms of their not only commerce but how they connect and what's important. When you find that stuff, I think you'll be able to make a lot of money.
Hi, folks. We have a special guest on our podcast today. I want to introduce Zoltan Istvan. He is a libertarian candidate for California governor in 2018. He's often considered one of the world's leading transhumanists after his popular run in the 2016 U.S. presidential race as a science and technology candidate. Zoltan believes his career as a futurist by publishing he started his career as a futurist by publishing The Transhumanist Wager, which is an award-winning #1 bestseller that has been compared hundreds of times to works by authors like Ayn Rand. Zoltan is also a leading technology journalist, a successful entrepreneur, and a former filmmaker and on-camera reporter for the National Geographic Channel. His futurist work and promotion of radical science has reached over 100 million people. He is a graduate of Columbia University and lives in San Francisco with his physician wife and 2 young daughters. Breitbart wrote that Istvan is a dynamic personality, as polarizing as he is engaging. New York Times recently wrote that Zoltan has a plausibility presidential aura. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Zoltan.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
No worries, man. So we are really excited to have you on the show. We prepared a number of questions that we want to ask you. We've talked about things like transhumanism before and the future of government. So without any further ado, we wanted to get you on the show for, like we said, a number of reasons. One of those being, first and foremost, are interesting in your journey and transformation from a journalist to futurist to politician. So to start off the show, Zoltan, I just please tell me exactly how did all this transition happen?
Well, sure. Like any other futurist, I was very interested in science fiction as I was growing up and as a child. And what happened is when I was studying at college, I came across an article on cryonics where people freeze themselves and then they, hopefully come back to life one day when the science is actually there, maybe 50 or 100 years. And as soon as I knew the field of cryonics existed, I thought, wow, I want to dedicate myself to overcoming death through science and technology. That seems a great goal for life. That said, then I got interested in journalism after my degree, and I worked for National Geographic for a number of years. And, this idea of being a transhumanist was not necessarily put on the back burner, but was just in the back of my mind. And then I had a very close call with a landmine in Vietnam that made me realize, wow, I better start dedicating my life to transhumanism now and not just writing, articles. So after that, I came back to the United States. I'd spend most of my time for National Geographic abroad. And I wrote this novel, The Transhumanist Wager, which, went on to do really well, became a bestseller, and really explored the idea of transhumanist activism. But what it mainly did was gave me a public platform for, sharing these ideas with the world. And it's also a political manifesto. So it wasn't very much of a jump once I had a public platform to run for president in 2016 as a transhumanist. And of course, that got so much attention that I was, kind of took my platform and made it even bigger. And so that's sort of where I am now as a, libertarian candidate for governor of California, also eyeing the 2020 nomination. I'm, planning on taking transhumanist and futurist issues into politics as far as I can go. And maybe if I get lucky, I'll end up in the White House someday.
Well, so why libertarian? That's my next question. Is I had looked at some videos when you were running as a transhumanist, and now you've gotten into this libertarian. Why libertarian?
Well, sounds I totally understand the question. Let me just first clarify that I'm actually a left-leaning libertarian, so I'm not one of those really hardcore like let's give up our driver's licenses type of guy. That said, I believe in this concept of morphological freedom, which is the core transhumanist concept, the right that people have, that you should have the right to do with your body whatever you want to do, so long as it doesn't hurt somebody else. Well, that's about the most libertarian concept you can think of, that you own the rights of your body. And of course, that's sort of the basis of my own philosophy too. So when I was looking for a larger platform to kind of engage politics with, well, the Libertarian Party and libertarianism really works great with science and radical technology and what I think is going to be the future. So that's the main reason I'm going there. And, I don't like taxes. I don't like regulation, just like anybody else. So, libertarians want to defend your freedom and keep government out of your bedroom and out of your pocket. It sounds pretty good to me. And it also sounds very transhumanist.
Yeah. And that's really great, because I wanted to ask you, I've heard it before, but I kind of wanted to give you another chance to give this voice, right? The transhumanist as a cause, right? Jack and I, we look at transhumanism as a trend, as an idea. But one thing that I've heard is that, you believe that transhumanism is a great platform because what it's doing is it's embedding the knowledge of science and technology into the political landscape where it doesn't exist. So, I'm interested, why did you choose to make this a part of your platform? And also, we live in an extremely divided time, right? Neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump brought up really artificial intelligence or 3D printed bones like we were talking about, or the future of exoskeletons in warfare. So I think that's a particularly novel, interesting thing. But is this campaign going to be a bipartisan campaign? Do you think that transhumanism is the equalizer, the bridge between the divided times of America now?
Well, I think you have to, I'll try to explain to you what I'm doing. 30 years ago, Bernie Sanders was working on the issues that he believed in. And it just happened to be that in 2016, Bernie Sanders' kind of popularity rose to the national attention to where he's now essentially the most popular politician in America. And I'm very hopeful that while transhumanism may be a bit obscure now, and it's a little bit fringe to many people, we might wake up in 15 years and say, wow, there's this guy and he's been dedicating all this time to this movement that now is an everyday part of our lives. AI, driverless cars, genetic editing, eliminating cancer, these kinds of things. And I'm hopeful that even though it may sound a bit fringe right now, transhumanism will one day be this mainstream thing that everybody talks about. And while Hillary and Trump won't discuss science whatsoever, and they didn't in the presidential debates, I've been, saying this is the most important thing that's going to be happening to the human race. It already is the most important thing, but certainly in the next 5, 10, and 15 years, it's going to be all that we're talking about. We have the ability to augment our intelligence and have the brain power of Einstein in physics, or we have the ability to literally eliminate disability, or we have telepathic communications. We're doing a podcast just through our mind, not through any kind of internet interface. This stuff is happening and will happen in the next decade. And, who's going to be out there to represent it? So in my opinion, I didn't really join. What happened was I didn't want to run for politics. I was a transhumanist who said, wow, there's no transhumanism in politics. I ought to try to bring it into the forefront there. And that's sort of how I got involved in it and why I think it's such an important part. We're all going to wake up one day, in a decade or 2 decades, and say that transhumanism is the most important political question of our time. And how do we deal with that?
Sure, and I think that's really a fantastic idea, and that's something to be really applauded. So thank you for kind of bringing this to the forefront. One thing about your story, though, right? I'm fascinated with is that you were an adventurer, right? At 21, you sailed around the world. You've been to 100 countries. You invented volcano boarding. You've been to you've been to warscapes. You've seen a lot, right? So, and this is actually typically not what we think when we think of the futurist type of lifestyle. Futurists are they're in their darkened room next to a laptop, understanding about these future things, and they know something very specifically, right? They cater to transhumanism or the future of gaming or what have you. So there's not a lot of people who sort of connect with real life like you did, and then found your way into transhumanism. Do you think because of your connection to the reality that is living on Earth as a human being, do you think this gives you a special view of what transhumanism really means? And actually, that's another question. What does transhumanism actually mean to you?
Well, sure, yeah, and it's always good to just define it. Of course, transhumanism means many different things to many different people, but for me, it's a social movement of many millions of people now around the world that want to use science and technology to radically modify the human being and also to modify the human experience. And that can be anything from merging with machines to putting all sorts of synthetic organs into your body, even including driverless cars and ethical decisions on if a car has to crash, which does it crash into a single senior citizen or a young family, whatever it is. These are very transhumanist issues, and so that's really what the movement is all about. It's just all this radical technology and science that we are now starting to experience on a literally daily level. But I think I was quite radical in my youth, and I've always been somebody who engaged death, meaning that I was fascinated with death. And perhaps that fascination has continued. It doesn't mean that I want to die. It just means that I'm fascinated with sort of extreme experiences and, pushing the edge. And I think many transhumanists, if you actually look at them right now, as the movement is still very young, you would say, yeah, a lot of them are to some extent fringe, or they don't really fit in the mainstream, or many of these different ideas, or they feel really either they want to conquer death, or they're afraid of death, or they don't like the human body, they want to become a machine. There are lots of different types of aspects of transhumanism, but whatever it is, most transhumanists don't really fit the mold. You're not going to find them watching cable television at 8 p.m. at night, whatever the latest sitcom is. these are usually people that are either behind a desk studying science or trying to create some kind of new discovery, or technologists. But they're sort of a different kind of person that really wants to use science and technology to radically change who they are.
Well, and I guess my question for you is, where do you think? So, as a transhumanist, I mean, where do you put a stop on transhumanism for yourself, maybe, or I mean, think of your children. Like, do you think that we will eventually be, some uncaring, unfeeling robots? The singularity. You can talk about that, but I mean, would you rather? I mean, here's an interesting question for you. Would you rather have your daughters live forever as incorporated into technology, or short time as complete human beings? I mean, where is your stopping point for that?
Well, and just your listeners know, I don't even consider that I mean, I consider, of course, a question, but I know the answer 100%. I would rather my daughters live under any circumstances. And I think one of the main things here is to understand is when you ask how far would I go? Well, I will go as far as I can go. And I think most transhumanists would say that. But a lot of people try to say, oh, transhumanism is, the separation of humanity, and merging it with a machine. But it's not a separation. We're going to take the very best of us as human beings, as mammals, and then we're going to incorporate that into whatever the next type of living life form we sort of merge into or become. Even AI is not going to be without mammalian traits. AI might actually have much stronger versions of love through its capacity of, neural connections or just connections. That, those connections could be 1,000,000 times more intricate and complex than the human brain. So maybe the form or the value of love that actually an AI will feel in a 50 years time could be much more significant than any mammal could ever have felt. So I want to experience that. In fact, I believe love is going to be far stronger once I start merging with machines and have more capacity in my brain. Our brains are only 3 pounds. They're like these little pieces of meat. But you're talking about a server that might be the size of the Empire State Building, and you're plugged directly into it. Our capacity, our ability to love, to experience things, to live differently could be dramatically different. And I very much look forward to experiencing as far as I can go.
Well, and so do you believe that's just the natural progression of society? That's the evolution of man is to become, this other being?
Yes, I firmly believe that. It doesn't mean that some people won't want to stay behind and be human beings indefinitely, but I'm quite certain, just like our destiny was to go from primates to human beings, our destiny is now to go from human beings to machines. But let's be honest, the machine age might only last 10, 20, or 30 years. Once AI comes, and once we tie our brain into that AI through neural prosthetics or whatnot, the machine age might only last a decade, and then it'll be something else like quantum intelligence that's just organized on some other level. I mean, that's sort of what the singularity is. When technology gets evolved so fast that when brains can't even define it or understand it. But I want to proceed with that, and I feel like wherever we go, it's going to be wonderful. Now, if it's not wonderful, I assume we'll stop. Maybe we'll stop as robots and say the singularity is too complex for us to understand. But I suspect wherever we go, we're gonna, it's going to get better and better.
Yeah. And you did talk about, right, overcoming biological death, and it even extending our life by 20, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. This is all actually a really positive movement to me for the human condition. But we've spoken to other futurists, right, and this is moving beyond just the biological death, right? This is actually using things like avatar bots or personal bots, which can mimic your personality. So based on an artificial intelligence engine, maybe, I think Black Mirror had an episode like this where it mimicked the social media interaction with the person and can create an avatar bot. So is transhumanism even beyond just having the ability to augment our life with great technology inside of ourselves, but also taking the essence that is us and having that live beyond us? So in essence, you could have relationships with your family not only 30 or 40 years extra, but maybe 400 or even 40 or 400,000 years after that. Is this something that you think of? How far do you think this forever life in transhumanism can go?
Well, I think this forever life can probably go forever, at least, millions and millions of years, let's just say hypothetically. But, already there are people creating, rudimentary AIs that operate on Facebook. So if somebody dies, like, a spouse or a parent, that, and you record enough of those thoughts, that person can then respond to you on Facebook like they're almost living. I mean, this is stuff that exists today. There are various companies dedicated to that. But I think in the future, I've been in Second Life. In fact, in my presidential campaign, I campaigned a number of times in Second Life, and they created an avatar that looks very similar to me. And, I could easily imagine that I'm able to download my thoughts. I deal with media all the time and videos and documentaries. And, it's possible because of neural prosthetics that we would be able to take our thoughts directly and put it in that avatar. And, a lot of the interesting philosophical questions is that you? And, frankly, I don't really care if it's me or not. I just like the idea that it's something like me. And that's a part of transhumanism. It doesn't have to be necessarily, I don't want to die, but I'm happy to know that other parts of me live indefinitely. In my presidential campaign, I visited a place called Terrasem, which deals specifically in spiritual transhumanism. And they have antennas on their property, and they send out these bytes of information, this data, that they take in all this kind of like, you go in front of a camera and you record your thoughts and then you shoot it out to the stars because they think singularities have already happened and those singularities will somehow consume that data that's being there. And that's a part of your, I don't want to say soul, but it's certainly a part of your somehow your experience in life. Is that transhumanism? Yes, it is. It's very much transhumanism. It's not me living forever because I now have a biological heart that never has heart disease, but it's something else. And I definitely appreciate it. So there are many different ways that transhumanists are trying to overcome their biological limitations. And a lot of that involves just, ones and zeros, pure data.
Sure. Do you think that there are actually political and sociological problems that happen with transhumanism? I mean, one thing, but I'm a positivist, right? I think very positively. I'm all about, injecting technology and understanding it. And, in some ways, I think technology is a great lever to the next stage of human evolution. And I think you do too. But I mean, we do know that there are political and sociological problems that come with technology, black swan events that we don't even think about. Are there any problems that you have ideated on when it comes to the transhumanism movement that you think are, could have a negative impact if we don't sort of watch how we, institute it in society?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, that's one of the reasons I actually run as a transhumanist in politics, whether it's for governor or president or whatever, is it's not only cheerleading transhumanism. I'm also saying, look, we don't want Terminator to, a Terminator scenario to end up. And AI is one of the most important national and global security concerns the world has. I consult with the United States Navy, and we all know that this is a very scary situation, that a computer can shut down power grids, can shut down water plants, can send viruses across all the computers and make empty bank accounts. I mean, AI is a very real worry, even though I very much support the development of artificial intelligence. But it's not just that. It's the fact that for under $1,000, you can go on eBay and buy a biotechnology kit and create some kind of terrorism lab in your house if you know what you're doing. There's many different types of factors and worries about transhumanism that are coming to the forefront right now. And I have openly said it, since I wrote my book, The Transhumanist Wager, which is, a very, it's somewhat of an anti-religious book. It essentially says in a very conservative government is going to try to shut down transhumanism because the modification of the human being is essentially blasphemy from a biblical perspective. And of course, that holds very true in the Mike Pence and the Donald Trump government that we have right now in the White House. We are facing a time when there probably will be civil strife over the next 5 or 10 years as genetic editing allows people to start augmenting intelligence, even doing things like changing your skin color. You talk about what's happening in different parts of the United States with racism. Well, in 10 years, people might be able to change their skin color. We already have the technology to permanently change our eye color. So how does that change racism? So yes, these are very difficult, questions, very challenging times. I think ultimately transhumanism will be a huge benefit to humanity, but we're entering a landscape in American politics and global politics like we've never seen before. Do robots get to vote in 10 years when they become as smart as human beings? Well, there's in 10 years time, there's going to be maybe 50 times more robots than human beings on planet Earth. These are incredibly difficult questions. So, whatever happens, though, the future is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, and that kind of will switch us over from transhumanism to politics, because I know this is another important topic that you've covered. One thing that I found fascinating is there was an article that you wrote recently talking about universal basic income, and so that's something that Chris and I talk about a lot on this show, and any proper futurist show would cover, because that's as you said, there's going to be 50 times more robots than people in the next couple of years. So Zoltan, one thing that I find interesting is that you wrote that article talking about the ways to fund UBI, and that's part of your platform. Can you tell us your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I have I've always supported a basic income, but I was looking for a libertarian version to do it. And this year I finally found one called a federal land dividend. The bottom line is that the United States government owns approximately $150 trillion worth of federal land. Most of it is in the western part of the United States. And that is mostly unused land. And actually, if you divide that by about 325 million citizens, it means that every single person gets almost $500,000. So right now, you and every single one of your listeners actually owns about $500,000 worth of federal land if there's an American citizen. So the question is, well, how can we monetize that in an age when machines are going to be very quickly taking over jobs? We just read, a couple months ago, the McDonald's stock is hitting an all-time high because they're starting to automate the people that take orders. And of course, driverless cars are going to, completely decimate the trucking industry and the taxi industry. So we have a huge amount of people over the next decade, probably 20 to 50 million, that might have their jobs very seriously challenged by machines. What do we do with those people? They can't just easily retrain, because by the time they retrain, their jobs will be taken. Well, I support a basic income, and I believe that, using federal land to start pushing that basic income, to monetize that basic income, is the way to do it. And I have suggested that we lease out the land. It's a bipartisan idea. The capitalists will like it. The liberals will like it because it solves poverty. But of course, the capitalists will like it because it gives them new, areas to develop. The only thing is the environmentalists don't like it. And of course, in California, where I'm running as governor, that's been the biggest trick in selling that. And well, everyone seems to like a basic income. No, a lot of people are very skeptical about using pristine land that's undeveloped to financially support that. But when they start losing enough jobs, I think they're going to say, it's time to start cutting down more of the forest, even if it's something we don't like.
Yeah, well, I want to quote you on this, because this is one thing that I saw that really spoke to me as your libertarian platform, and this is a quote from you. It said, you said that the distrust of big government, crony capitalism, and unmanageable debt seared themselves into my value system. It just made sense to embrace a philosophy that promotes maximum freedom and personal accountability. I think that that's one great thing about your platform, is that you can speak to people on both sides. And I mean, tell us about that. I mean, have you had a lot of support coming from both liberals and conservatives on your issues? I mean, are people standing up and supporting you because of these things?
Yes, and that's what's been really great about this federal land dividend. I call it a federal land dividend because I don't want to call it a basic income, because a basic income is now a loaded word. It's like a word only for the leftists. And I keep trying to tell people that this is a very libertarian idea. This is beyond bipartisan. This is great for everybody. It's not that only the rich or the poor get money. It's everybody gets money. But yeah, I mean, what's been really great is the media has been coming out in strong support of not strong support. They've been allowing this to be discussed widely. And I think that's what's really important, because I think a lot of people are starting to look for a new way to say, wow, everyone realizes that capitalism may not survive. And it simply can't survive. My wife is an OBGYN. She trained for 19 years, and they've told her, they said, if a robot can deliver babies better than you for, half the cost and do it 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Well, at some point, doctors are going to be replaced. And if doctors who trained for 19 years can be replaced, I think that means the majority of us can be replaced. So we all have to prepare for this eventuality in the next decade or two that we will be challenged by machines. So we need a method so that we don't have civil strife. And really, the reason I believe in a basic income is because I don't want to see revolution. The most important thing for transhumanism, and you can see this happening right now with Donald Trump and the crazy anger they're generating with North Korea. The very worst thing the world can happen to the world in transhumanism right now is that we get involved in wars, that we get involved in kind of, destructive behavior that stops science. What we need is a economy and the freedom to innovate. And if that can continue to happen, then all of a sudden you're going to wake up in 15 years and everybody, cancer is going to be eliminated, heart disease is going to be eliminated, we're all going to live indefinitely, and I'll be able to see my kids for the rest of my life. And my father, who died 3 months ago, some tragedy like that will never happen. But that only happens if we can keep economies going smoothly and science can go undeterred. But wars deter science. I mean, yeah, they're great for bomb making, but they're not good for the kinds of things that affect your healthcare, affect your parents' healthcare. So we really need to have a stable society. And that's one reason why I really support a basic income. It means there won't be a civil revolution when people start losing their jobs.
Sure. And this is going right into the conversation that we're having on really just government in general. We talk about what it means to live in an interconnected society. And, we're talking, not only about UBI, but we're talking about transhumanism. Both of these ideas, and including the robot ideas, are going to completely reshape how society is. There are a lot of people that are anti-globalists. They don't want to see, our nation states go away, and they sort of like having a flag and those sorts of things. And there is a whole other side that sees the world as one holistic unit. And then there's sort of the government and constitutions inside of these nations that create these very specific systems, which actually either allow for very quick change, like a China with their social market system, or very slow change, like the system that we have in the United States. So, do you have an idea of how not only UBI, but the future of science and technology and the future of society is going to shape actually the future of government and the future of nations?
Well, I be honest with you, I think a lot of the future rests with artificial intelligence. We are coming to an era when we have to ask ourselves, if in 10 years' time we have the power to create a machine that thinks as smart as us, do we do that? Because that's going to mean, even more difficult questions. Well, why should we have governors and why should we have president when a machine can do that equally or better, and maybe have no influence from lobbyists or third party, different types of, like I said, crony capitalism. Those are the kinds of things that we have to ask ourselves, especially me as a libertarian. Is that something that supports libertarian agenda? And, the answer is I don't really know, but I want to look more into it, because if we do have machine intelligence able to run things and they can run it a lot more smoothly, as we already know from driverless cars, the amount of accidents that driverless cars get in is tiny. I mean, it's like a percentage. And every single year, more and more machine intelligence starts entering into our world, whether it's through Siri or whether it's just through, automated checkout stands at Safeway or whatever it is. So if that continues to exponentially grow, I think our world's going to be quite different. And that will dramatically affect government, because government might, for the very first time, and I've said this again and again, this is why libertarians should support transhumanism and technology, is technology has a way of shrinking everything, and it's going to also shrink government. And I think that could be very effective both for Republicans, for Democrats, as well as for libertarians. It could usher in an age of freedom and prosperity and just efficiency. That's the key word there, efficiency, that could make everybody's lives a lot better.
Yeah, and that's something that we look at a lot too, and we look at that positive view. But we need to be contrarian sometimes, and one thing that we know is that the world is stratified. There are the haves and there are the have-nots, and there's all the different iterations in between. And one thing that people talk about when it comes to science, technology, and of course transhumanism is the fact that not everybody is going to be able to afford to have some of these technologies to be a part of their lives, right? Similar to the way we have healthcare and or economies and or governmental structures in some places like even Somalia or Afghanistan. Even common infrastructure is very difficult. What do you say to the folks out there that say that science, technology, and the burgeoning platform that could be transhumanism could just be another elitist tool that is going to separate the haves from the have-nots?
Yes, and I got to be honest, that is the number one question I get asked about transhumanism all the time. What's to keep the 1%, which I don't belong to the 1%, just so you know. What's to keep the 1% from taking that technology and just essentially leaving everybody else behind? Well, I think the way, the best example is the cell phone. There are a lot of developing nations that don't have clean water and don't have good housing and don't have a lot of other, food. But almost every single person in the world now has access to a cell phone because cell phones can come for free. And in most places, and they do in most places, you'll have mud huts in Africa where people have cell phones. I think the same thing is happening in many cases with vaccinations and also some other critical types of, what we'd call essential technologies. And that's happened because of the way capitalism has kind of pushed it through. I think when you start talking about human augmentation, you start talking about getting rid of heart disease because we have bionic hearts. When you start talking about synthetic eyes and whatnot, a lot of people are going to have access to these types of technology. They may still not have access to clean water and clean food and things like that. But I'm guessing just the way capitalism works, as long as it survives, is that the super rich and the ultra 1% will never leave us completely behind or be able to, because they sort of depend upon us consuming those products that they're putting out. And those products are going to get quicker and quicker into turnaround to when, it comes out. For example, I think if we come out, heart disease kills a third of everybody we know. And if we come out with the bionic heart, which a couple companies are working on right now, it's only going to be a few years before that bionic heart, maybe the cheaper models, ends up being available widely to a bunch of other people. Right now, the bionic heart costs $200,000. So only the very richest could afford it. But I think very quickly, since it's just a pump, just like a cell phone, it's just, you can make a pump quite cheaply. It's a matter of, getting enough people to want it. So this will be one way we can kind of keep everybody alive, even if they don't have the best technology in them. I'm a big believer that it's getting easier and quicker to get technology to market and to worldwide distribution than ever before. So I'm not worried the rich are going to leave us behind. What I'm more worried about is making sure that, there are some types of, and this is where I think I lean a little bit further left than most libertarians, saying we need to ensure that the world doesn't allow the rich to become super powerful. And I think capitalism will probably be that driving force, but I don't mind stepping in and saying, you know what, I don't want the Chinese augmenting their intelligence when the Americans are not. I don't want a generation of Chinese babies that are twice as smart as Americans. We need to stand up and say, we're going to have to all do this together, and that's the best way forward for humanity. We're entering an era that's quite different.
Well, and that kind of piggybacks off my question for you, Zoltan, is, what is your ideal society? What do you see in the next, 50 years? Give us your vision of if your ideal transhumanist society.
Well, I think my ideal let me just say, first off to your listeners, I think, the idea that the human race is going to continue beyond 25 years would be startling to me. If we have an artificial intelligence here in 10 years and we're able to, as Elon Musk believes, in 4 or 5 years, be able to communicate directly with it through neural prosthetics, we will merge with that AI within a decade or even 15 years. So even 25 years out, we could be looking at a civilization that's dramatically different, probably much more cyborg. And once you have AI, it's going to create artificial hearts, artificial pancreases, artificial everything, and maybe even uploading oneself. So I don't even know if it'll actually be even biological anymore in a 25-year window. The singularity will certainly have happened, or I believe, unless governments step in or something like that. But in an ideal society is that we have enough parameters that we maintain all our social freedoms, but it's okay to have some government or some kind of, at least maybe societal kind of policy that says, let's not leave people behind. I'm going to say this again and again. It doesn't matter how far I go as a libertarian, I'm not going to leave people behind. I don't believe that we need homeless people. I don't believe that we need poverty. I don't believe that these things must exist. I would like to eliminate them, and I want to create policy that does so. Now, I want that policy to be libertarian in essence, but I'm not planning on leaving anyone behind. And I mean that when I say the same thing for transhumanist technology. The same thing goes for the singularity. We don't want to make it so that some people, get a great, beautiful future full of all these wonders, and others are just stuck living and dying. I think we need to create a policy, a plan, a global plan where everybody can benefit from all these things together. And that might mean, putting the brakes on some of these technologies at times, so that the social kind of culture can catch up. But I'm willing to do that for the greater good.
Well, thank God somebody is, right. Well, that's really good to hear. I see a lot of folks, not only in politics, but even in society, they're scared of things like transhumanism, or they're scared of science and technology gobbling up what it means to actually be a person. What is it, do you think, that people get wrong when it comes to not only transhumanism, but how we're ingratiating and integrating science and technology in our lives? Is there something fundamentally that people, in government and those folks that maybe don't have the education get wrong when it comes to this blending of man and machine?
Well, yeah, and I don't want to be that guy, but let me just be honest. Judeo-Christian framework. God is printing on our money. Somebody sneezes, we say God bless you. Pledge of Allegiance includes God. I mean, we live in a world where there is supposed to be an afterlife, and that afterlife is with the greater majority of us in America. That 75% go meet Jesus. And if you're taught that from age 1 or 2 on, and even if you're not in a very religious household, it's still there in culture. I mean, all 535 members of Congress, all 9 Supreme Court justices, our president, our vice president, they all publicly say they believe in this format. Well, it's very hard to get merging with a machine and living indefinitely when you have this kind of culture that you've been trained to from day one as a child. I've been, one of the main goals of my campaigns is to say Christianity and Islam, or whatever it is, it doesn't have to be opposed to merging with machines. That might just be God's plan. Now, I'm a secular person, non-religious for the most part, but people can still believe that. Jesus' wonders can be done through transhumanist technology. And I believe if Congress and other Christian people could start to believe that, our culture could start to change. And when you talk about modifying the human being, you could see it maybe in a spiritual framework or a religious framework. If that happens, all of a sudden, the world is going to change, because very quickly the government's going to start putting in a ton more effort and money and emphasis in saying it's okay to be a transhumanist nation. Right now, the biggest problem we have is that as soon as genetic editing came on the forefront 2 years ago, the very first thing that all the government said is, oh, moratorium, moratorium. Instead of this, wow, now we can finally eliminate cancer and heart disease in an embryonic stage. That would have been the normal scientific reaction. And the reason it didn't happen is because people thought it was somehow anti-religious. But science is not anti-religious. Science is neutral. Science is given to us. If there's a God, it was given to us by a God. If there's no God, it's still just given to us with how we do it. It's never been anything, never been positive or negative. Science has always been neutral and just simply what we make of it. And I say this again and again, I try to make it a huge crusade of mine to say that if you're a believer, this transhumanist technology can go 100% with your beliefs and be a part of the bigger spiritual plan that one believes in. And I think if we believe in that, then all of a sudden transhumanism has a much better shot of catching on, especially in our quite Christian nation.
This is really wonderful to hear, and I'm glad that we have another believer on this podcast. We're very much in that same vein. one thing that we're on a podcast, and we kind of point this out into the universe, and we're very early, sort of in our podcast, so we don't really get a lot of feedback, right? But you have spent years, actively promoting these ideas, and I'm sure you've learned a lot of lessons along the way of how people understand not only what transhumanism is, but how people what's the back and forth when you're talking about the future of government, the future of society, the future of California. So what are some of the hard lessons that you've learned as this sort of communicator of the future of the many possible worlds out there? Is there anything that you can tell our audience that really humbled you when it came to all the outreach that you've been doing over the last couple of years?
Well, sure. I think the biggest thing to understand about transhumanism is that what we're talking about is just a synonym for really good healthcare. And I know it sounds crazy. You're like trans and this, and the words are loaded. And it's this new movement, whatever. But what we're just talking about is eliminating disease and eliminating aging, or at least eliminating aging enough so that you have a choice when you die. Nobody's talking about living forever. Not realistically. Nobody's talking about, a perfect world, because that may not be possible. What we just want is to eliminate the specter of death so that we have a chance to die when we want. And we don't have to die because, we don't have to watch our child get leukemia and die. We don't have to watch our parents die from heart disease. People can have more choice in how they want to live their lives. And if they're a believer, they can check out whenever they want. But the idea is transhumanism is just really saying perfect healthcare. We're going to make it so that you have the ability to do anything you want and not have to suffer from the tragedies that our biological world is sort of revolves around. And again, it's not that we're going to eliminate all the tragedies. That's never going to happen, I doubt. But it just means we're going to get better and better and make it so that there's less and less of them. And I think everyone can agree, if they've ever lost a child or lost a parent or a spouse, that's just not fun. That's just the worst thing ever. So we can make it so that the world can really be perfect or very close to it. And I think that's really what transhumanism is about. It's just optimistic idea that healthcare can be almost perfect. We don't have to live day to day waiting for tragedy.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Zoltan. So I wanted to end the podcast on that note, but I did want to let our listeners know. So let us know when the and you can talk about this, but when is the voting for the gubernatorial election in California? Like what date it is? Because I feel like a lot of people sometimes when they get involved in the political process, they never really know when the voting time is. And also let our listeners know how someone could support you in your campaign, either monetarily or by volunteering for your campaign. How would they go about doing that?
Sure. Well, just my website is zoltanistvan.com, and you can just Google my name as well to find out a lot about my work, because I do write columns for Vice and Newsweek and a couple other places, so you can read my articles. And so in California, we have primaries, which means they take the top two candidates and then they go on to November. So next June of 2018, you'll see me on the ballot. If you're in California and you're a resident, you can just check my name, and I'd appreciate that. That doesn't mean you're actually voting for me for governor. It just means you're voting for me to get into the final runoff. So, if you're a Democrat or Republican, you can still feel good that you're not necessarily, it's not going to be the candidate. There's going to be a runoff after that. And, I think the main thing to understand is really that it's good to have people out there that are running political races that are trying to break outside of the norm. Because what's happening is science and technology really is starting to more than ever radically change our lives. But to not address the dangerous questions, the challenging questions, the beautiful questions, AI, CRISPR editing, telepathy, some of these other ideas, is to avoid it. And then some of this stuff is going to happen first. And, and then we'll be kind of blindsided by it. And as I mentioned, what if China ends up augmenting an entire generation of children with, special brain power because they didn't have, the hindrances that Americans had or something like that? I mean, geopolitical concerns are very important too. We all need to move forward, and America has to embrace this, whether it's conservative or not, or whether it's ready for it or not. We want to make sure we lead the world in science, and that takes you and your listeners to say, I'm ready to ask these questions and talk about it. So definitely, if you have a chance, I'd love a vote. And if nothing else, at least check out what transhumanism is all about, because it's definitely the wave of the future.
And we're gonna publish your we're gonna put some of your articles and things in our show notes so people can read some of what you've written about. And thanks again for joining us here tonight, Zoltan.
Thanks a lot, Zoltan. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. I had a great time talking to you.